The difference between mayo that lasts a week and mayo that lasts months comes down to a single ingredient, and most home cooks use too little of it. I have made homemade mayonnaise more times than I can count, and for years I kept running into the same problem everybody runs into. The mayo was delicious on day 1. By day 8, it smelled off. The texture turned watery, and I ended up throwing out half a jar. Sound familiar? That is not a technique problem, and it is not a storage problem, not at its root. It is a chemistry problem. And once you understand what is actually happening inside a jar of mayo, you will never waste a batch again. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which ingredient governs how long your homemade mayo stays safe and good, the right amount to use, why most recipes quietly shortchange you on it, and how to store the finished mayo so your effort is protected. You will walk away from this video able to make a batch of mayo that keeps properly, not crossed fingers properly, but genuinely, reliably properly. If you want the deeper breakdown that goes further than I can in one video, the guide's QR code is right there on the left side of your screen right now. Just open your phone's camera app, point it at the code on the left, and it pulls up instantly. And that same QR code is going to stay pinned in the top right corner of the screen for the rest of the video, so you can grab it at any point while we keep going. No need to stop what you are doing. Let me be honest with you about something first. Most of what you have heard about keeping homemade mayo fresh is incomplete at best. I have watched folks add a bit of lemon juice, seal the jar tight, keep it cold, and call it done. That gets you maybe 10 days if you are lucky. I have seen people told that the secret is using a very clean jar, or blending it faster, or even adding a layer of olive oil on top. None of that addresses the real issue. The real issue is pH. And the ingredient that controls pH in mayo is vinegar. Not lemon juice alone, not lime juice, not a splash of something tart. Vinegar, specifically the kind with a guaranteed, consistent acidity level, is what separates a jar of homemade mayo that goes off in a week from one that stays genuinely safe and stable for weeks, or with proper technique, for a very long time indeed. Commercial mayonnaise has been shelf-stable for generations, not because of fancy preservatives. Most mass-produced mayo has surprisingly few of them, but because manufacturers are precise about their acid content. The acidity level is controlled. At home, most of us eyeball it, and eyeballing vinegar in mayo is exactly where things go wrong. Here is the science in plain terms. Mayonnaise is an emulsion, oil suspended in tiny droplets inside a liquid base made from egg yolk and acid. That emulsion creates a water activity environment, meaning the moisture inside the mayo is not as freely available to bacteria as the moisture in, say, a glass of water. But that protection is not enough on its own. What stops harmful bacteria from getting a foothold is the acidity. When the pH of your mayo is low enough, generally around 4 or below, most of the bacteria that would spoil or sicken you simply cannot grow. At a higher pH, those same bacteria can. The acid is the lock on the door. Standard distilled white vinegar sold in American and most European grocery stores comes in at around 5% acidity. That is the number you want to build around. Apple cider vinegar at the same percentage works too, and adds a gentler flavor. What you do not want to use as your primary acid is fresh lemon juice alone, because the acidity of a lemon varies enormously. One lemon might give you plenty of acid, the next one barely any. I will be honest, for years I used fresh lemon in my mayo and thought I was doing it right. I was not. Lemon juice as a secondary flavoring is perfectly fine. As your primary acid, it is unreliable. Stick with measured vinegar as your foundation. Now, how much vinegar are we talking about? Most homemade mayo recipes call for 1 to 2 teaspoons of vinegar per cup of oil. That is almost certainly not enough. When I look at the ratios in properly acidified commercial-style mayo, the vinegar content relative to the egg and oil is meaningfully higher. A more protective starting point, one that food safety guidance has long supported for acid-preserved foods, is closer to 1 tablespoon of 5% vinegar per large egg yolk, alongside roughly 3/4 of a cup of oil. That keeps the pH low enough to matter. If your recipe calls for less than that, it is likely under-acidified, which is exactly why that batch goes soft and sour in a week. The next factor that works alongside vinegar is salt. Salt is not just flavor in mayo, it draws out moisture and creates a less hospitable environment for bacterial growth. A full half teaspoon of salt per egg yolk is not excessive in a preservation context. It is doing real work. Recipes that call for just a pinch are cutting corners on preservation, not just seasoning. The way I see it, if you are taking the time to make mayo from scratch, you might as well make it last. If you want to go deeper on the underlying kitchen chemistry than I can cover here, that is exactly what the guide is built for. Open your phone's camera app and point it at the QR code still up in the top right corner of your screen, and you will have it. Now I want to talk about eggs, because this is where a lot of people get nervous, and rightfully so. Raw egg yolks in homemade mayo are a real consideration. The acid in a properly made batch does raise the pH of the egg yolk environment, which reduces but does not eliminate risk. If you are making mayo for a family with young children, elderly folks, or anyone with a compromised immune system, the safest move is pasteurized eggs. Eggs that have been gently heat-treated to kill off any bacteria without cooking them. They are available in most large grocery stores, usually sold in a carton near the regular eggs. They cost a little more, maybe 50 cents extra per carton, but they eliminate the guesswork entirely. In my experience, pasteurized yolks emulsify just as well as regular yolks. There is no trade-off in texture. Hold that thought. I want to come back to storage in a moment, because the mistake most folks make there is the one that quietly undoes all the careful work with vinegar and salt. It is not what you would expect, and I want to make sure you have the full picture before we get there. First, let me walk you through the method that ties all of this together. Start with your egg yolks at room temperature. Cold yolks do not emulsify as smoothly. For every 2 yolks, measure out 1.5 cups of a neutral oil, like light olive oil or avocado oil. Strong extra virgin olive oil can work, but it sometimes turns bitter when blended. Add 1 tablespoon of your 5% distilled white vinegar, half a teaspoon of dry mustard powder, and half a teaspoon of fine salt. Mustard powder is worth calling out here because it does double duty. It contributes a trace of acid, and it contains a natural emulsifier that helps the oil and egg yolk bond and stay bonded over time. Commercial mayo almost always contains mustard in some form. If your recipe leaves it out, that is another gap worth filling. Blend the yolks, vinegar, mustard, and salt first. Then add the oil in the slowest stream you can manage, ideally drop by drop for the first 1/4 cup. The emulsion forms during those first few seconds of oil addition. If you rush it, the oil and egg never fully bond, and you get a broken, greasy mayo that will separate in the jar. Once the first 1/4 cup is in, and the mixture looks thick and pale yellow, you can increase to a thin, steady stream. The whole batch takes maybe 3 minutes in a blender, or with an immersion blender. Taste for seasoning at the end, and if you want brightness, a small amount of fresh lemon juice, perhaps a teaspoon, is fine at this stage, now that your acid foundation is already established. Storage is where things go sideways, even for folks who nailed the recipe. The mistake I see over and over is storing mayo in a wide-mouthed jar that gets opened multiple times a day. Every time you open that jar, you introduce air and whatever bacteria happen to be on the spoon or knife you dipped in. A narrow-mouthed jar with a clean spoon each time dramatically reduces that contamination risk. Transfer what you will use in the next few days into a small jar and keep the main batch sealed. Label it with the date you made it. In the coldest part of your refrigerator, not the door, which warms up every time you open it, but the back of a lower shelf, a properly acidified batch made with pasteurized eggs and adequate vinegar can keep well for around a month. Some well-preserved batches with tight storage discipline last longer. A full year is achievable if you go one step further and use a pressure canning method designed for acidified condiments, but that is a separate process, and the standard refrigerator method gets most folks everything they need. Now, that mistake I promised you. The one that undoes the careful work. It is this: adding vinegar at the end as an afterthought. I have seen recipes that tell you to adjust seasoning at the end and suggest adding a bit more vinegar if it tastes flat. The problem is that vinegar added to a finished emulsion does not distribute the same way vinegar that was present at the beginning does. It sits in pockets rather than lowering the overall pH evenly. The acidity that matters for preservation has to be built in from the start during the emulsification, not corrected at the finish. If your current recipe is one of those, add the acid first, or rework the ratios before you begin. I want to say a word about flavored mayo variations, because once you understand the base method, the whole world of flavored aioli and specialty spreads opens up. Roasted garlic mayo, smoked paprika mayo, herb mayo, all of them follow the same acid-first rule. If you are blending roasted garlic into your base, for example, garlic adds moisture and some sugar, which can slightly raise your pH and tip the preservation balance. The fix is straightforward. Add an extra half teaspoon of vinegar to any batch that includes a significant amount of added produce. Same rule applies to sun-dried tomatoes, roasted peppers, or fresh herbs in larger quantities. The foundational logic holds across all of them. Keep the acid where it needs to be, and your variation will last just as long as the plain version. If this topic has you thinking about other places in your kitchen where pH and acid do the quiet work of preservation, the guide goes further into those ideas than I can here. Open your camera app, point it at the QR code still sitting in the top right corner of your screen, and you will have it in seconds. Let me also touch on olive oil mayos, because I know a lot of folks in their 50s and older are interested in the health profile. A light or mild olive oil, as I mentioned, works well. The one thing to be aware of is that high-quality extra virgin olive oil contains polyphenols that can turn bitter under the mechanical stress of blending. If you have ever made an olive oil mayo and found it tasted harsh after a day or two, that bitterness is why. The solution is to use a blend. Half light olive oil, half avocado oil, and your flavor stays clean, and the health benefits of olive oil are still there. A small but genuinely useful thing to know. Now let me give you the plain action plan. This week, pull out your current mayo recipe and check 3 numbers. How much vinegar relative to the oil, whether you are using a consistent 5% acid source, and whether you are building the acid in at the start. If any of those are off, adjust before your next batch. This month, if you make mayonnaise regularly, pick up a box of pasteurized eggs and keep them on hand. The extra cost is genuinely minimal, and the peace of mind is real. Going forward, make it a habit to label every batch with its date and store the bulk of it in the coldest spot in your refrigerator, pulling only what you need into a small working jar. There is no money in teaching folks that a tablespoon of vinegar and half a teaspoon of mustard powder are what stand between you and a jar of mayo that actually lasts. The simple truth costs almost nothing. I have watched people throw out batch after batch and never figure out why. You just figured it out in under 20 minutes. If you want to take this further, the fuller picture, the deeper answers this video can only touch on, open your camera app one more time and point it at the QR code still in the top right corner of your screen. That is everything I could not fit in here, right there waiting for you. Now I would love to hear from you. Do you make your own mayo at home, or has the short shelf life kept you from trying? Drop it in the comments. I read them, and some of the best tips I know came from folks in this community. If this video gave you something useful, there is a lot more where it came from. Hit subscribe and you will not miss what is coming next. Speaking of which, next time I want to show you how the same acid-first logic applies to homemade salad dressings that last weeks instead of days. Same principle, slightly different application, and the results will change the way you think about what is really in your refrigerator door.